In the year 1521, the walls of Grade shook beneath the thunder of Ottoman cannons. The sky turned black with smoke as desperate screams echoed through the streets of the besieged city. When the defenses finally gave way and the Janissaries stormed in, one of the darkest chapters of the Ottoman conquest began to unfold. For the women of the defeated warriors, their fate would be sealed by customs so cruel they shocked even the hardened standards of the medieval age. What followed an Ottoman victory was never just a matter of military triumph. It was a coldly efficient system of human domination, one that turned people into merchandise. The women of fallen enemies did not simply face exile or death. They faced something far worse: the erasure of their identity and dignity through practices that exposed the most merciless side of Ottoman expansionism. To grasp the true scale of this horror, we must journey to the heart of the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power, when Constantinople had become the beating center of a machine designed to turn conquest into a vast network of human exploitation. This system was no accident of war. It was not the chaos of victory or the bloodlust of soldiers. It was state policy meticulously designed, encoded in Islamic law, and executed through an organized administrative hierarchy. Every detail of what happened to the conquered was regulated, documented, and justified. Among the most chilling aspects of this structure was the concept of sabaya, women captured during war. This idea was deeply rooted in Islamic jurisprudence and applied by the Ottomans with an efficiency that bordered on industrial. When a city fell, the first act of the victors was not chaotic looting. It was cataloging, a systematic sorting of human lives. Specialized officers roamed the ruined streets, dividing men, women, and children into distinct categories. The women were then subjected to a degrading process of valuation. Their worth was measured not by character or humanity, but by physical appearance and perceived utility. The young and beautiful were set aside for the harems of high-ranking officers or marked for sale in the bustling slave markets of Constantinople. The elderly or less desirable were destined for brutal labor: the kitchens, the fields, or the dirtiest corners of domestic servitude. This was not done in secret. It was done with the precision of a business transaction. Ottoman physicians examined women as though inspecting livestock, checking their teeth, assessing their reproductive health, and measuring their bodies. Those deemed most valuable were branded or specially marked, separated from the others to await their new masters. This systematic dehumanization was only the first stage in a long descent that stripped away everything these women once were. The journey to the slave markets was itself a form of torment. Shackled, packed into wagons, or forced to walk hundreds of miles, many never made it alive. Those who did reach the great markets of Constantinople, Bursa, or Ankara soon realized their suffering had only just begun. These markets were not chaotic bazaars. They were organized institutions regulated by laws, supervised by officials, and equipped with systems of warranty for buyers. In the Grand Slave Market of Constantinople, located in the district of Eminönü, Christian women captured in war were displayed like goods in a shop window. Potential buyers could inspect them, checking their teeth, testing their muscle tone, evaluating their domestic skills. Every gesture, every examination was meant to crush any fragment of dignity that might still remain. For the youngest and most attractive captives, the fate that awaited them in the Ottoman hers was far from the romantic fantasies that would later appear in European literature. These harems were not palaces of luxury, but golden prisons, worlds of fear, rivalry, and survival. The imperial harem inside the Topkapı Palace housed thousands of women taken from across the empire. Greeks, Serbs, Armenians, Persians, Circassians, each struggling to endure a world ruled by suspicion and cruelty. But the harem was more than just a symbol of indulgence. It was a tool of political control. Every woman inside was expected to abandon her past completely, her native language, her faith, even her name. They were given Turkish names and trained in Ottoman customs. Failure to obey meant punishment, sometimes severe. This forced assimilation served one purpose: to erase the individual and reshape her into property, not just legally, but mentally and spiritually. Those who resisted conversion were subjected to relentless torment. Food and water were withheld. They were isolated in dark cells, beaten and humiliated until their will to resist was extinguished. Many women broken by the weight of captivity descended into madness or sought escape through death itself. The most disturbing feature of the Ottoman system was not just its cruelty. It was its organization. Every captured woman was registered in official books. Her age, origin, skills, and market value carefully noted by imperial scribes. Page after page, these records built an archive of human misery, proof that the Sultan's reach extended not just over land and cities, but over the bodies and souls of the conquered. For the wives of noblemen or commanders who had resisted the Ottomans fiercely, their punishment was designed to humiliate entire nations. Many were forced to serve in the harems of the very generals who had slain their husbands. It was a deliberate message to the defeated. No one, not even the women of the noble or the brave, could escape Ottoman vengeance. But behind this cruelty lay another purpose: economic gain. Captured women were not only exploited for labor or pleasure. They became tools of reproduction, used to breed the next generation of slaves. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically became the property of their master. This ensured that slavery did not merely replace populations. It perpetuated itself generation after generation. Mothers were forced to raise children who would never be theirs, knowing that at any moment they could be sold, traded, or gifted away. Forced conversion was another weapon of domination. Christian women were compelled to embrace Islam through ceremonies that were more acts of humiliation than faith. Refusal brought torture, sometimes slow, deliberate, and public. Once converted, they lost all legal ties to their families or homelands. Even if they escaped, there was no way back. The psychological wounds left by this system were profound and lifelong. Accounts from women who managed to escape or were later freed tell of deep, lasting trauma. Many could never reintegrate into their old communities. They had lost their language, their beliefs, their sense of belonging, everything that once defined who they were. The Ottoman system did not just enslave bodies. It broke spirits. Resistance was rare, crushed before it could spread. Some women organized secret escapes. Others starved themselves to death, and a few managed to send hidden messages to their families. 6. Those who were caught faced public torture. Examples meant to remind everyone else that defiance had no place in the Sultan's empire. This was not a spontaneous cruelty. It was the cold logic of empire, a machine that blended faith, law, and profit into one of the most sophisticated systems of human exploitation the world had ever seen. The Ottoman system of captivity did not end with a single generation. It was self-sustaining, a cycle of exploitation that reproduced itself through law, religion, and bureaucracy. What began as the spoils of war evolved into an entire economy of human lives, feeding the empire's wealth and reinforcing its hierarchy. Every act of conquest added new victims to the machine. With each victory, the number of captives multiplied, and the empire's bureaucrats recorded it all with chilling precision. There were no names in these ledgers, only descriptions. Christian girl, 17, from grade, capable of sewing healthy teeth. Each entry reduced a person to data, stripping away her humanity, her story, her existence beyond the ink on the page. The Ottoman scribes called it efficiency. History would come to know it as dehumanization. Even the markets themselves became reflections of this system's terrifying order. Slave auctions in Constantinople followed strict procedures. Buyers received receipts, guarantees, and rights of return. Merchants needed official permits. Taxes were collected from every transaction. To the empire, this was not cruelty. It was business. And in this business, women were the most valuable commodity. From the shores of the Adriatic to the mountains of the Caucasus, the Ottoman slave trade stretched across continents. Each conquered region became a new source of supply. Caravans brought chained women to the imperial heartland, a silent procession of suffering that stretched for hundreds of miles. Those who survived the journey entered a new world of hierarchy. At the top were the concubines of the Sultan's harem, women who through beauty, intelligence, or sheer chance rose to positions of influence. Beneath them were the countless others, servants, laborers, and slaves bound to noble households. But even within the gilded walls of Topkapi Palace, power was fragile. The imperial harem was a place of endless competition where survival depended on obedience and manipulation. Every woman there understood that her fate could shift with a single word or glance. Behind the silks and perfumes, there were secret punishments and quiet executions. The palace's marble floors had absorbed centuries of whispered terror. Some women sought to turn their captivity into power. Through cunning and patience, a few managed to influence politics and shape imperial decisions. Yet, even at the height of their influence, they were still bound by invisible chains. Their power existed only through proximity to the Sultan's will, a reminder that even the most privileged captives were never truly free. Beyond the palace, the fate of ordinary enslaved women was even more brutal. Those who served in the homes of merchants or soldiers lived under constant fear. They could be beaten, sold, or abandoned without consequence. The law treated them as property, and property had no voice. The system's cruelty was not only in its physical punishment, but in its emotional destruction. Mothers watched their children torn away and sold to strangers. Sisters were separated forever. Generations were erased, absorbed into a society that thrived on forgetting where they came from. And yet, traces of their existence remained. In letters smuggled through sympathetic traders, in prayers whispered in forbidden languages, in lullabies sung to children who would never know their mother's homeland. These fragments tell us that even in the heart of absolute domination, humanity struggled to survive. But the Ottoman system went further still. It had perfected a way to turn domination into administration. Every aspect of slavery, capture, transportation, sale, ownership, was documented and taxed. Officials kept careful records not only to maintain control, but also to maximize profit. It was a machine that ran on human misery. Over time, the empire's scholars and theologians wrote detailed justifications for this system. They cloaked it in the language of divine law, transforming greed into doctrine and cruelty into order. Conquest, they argued, was sanctioned by faith. The taking of captives was the natural right of the victor. And so the suffering of thousands was not only tolerated but celebrated as a sign of divine favor. This fusion of faith and exploitation gave the system a terrible permanence. It did not require hatred to function, only obedience. Soldiers obeyed orders. Merchants followed laws. Clerics blessed the process. Everyone had a role, and everyone believed they were simply fulfilling their duty. And that is what made it so horrifying. The women caught in this machine became ghosts in their own lives, forced to take new names, to forget their pasts, to worship gods they did not believe in. They lived suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither. Many forgot the sound of their native tongues, replaced by the commands and insults of their masters. A few managed to escape. Some were ransomed by distant relatives. Others fled through sympathetic networks of traders or monks. But freedom, when it came, was rarely a return. The years of captivity had carved deep scars that no liberation could erase. Those who returned to their villages found themselves strangers in familiar places. The people they had known were gone. Their families were broken. Their faith, once a source of strength, now reminded them of all they had lost. In these stories, the cruelty of the Ottoman system reveals its true purpose, not just to conquer land or bodies, but to annihilate identity. For the women of Grade, Thessaloniki, Sivo, and countless other cities, their capture marked the beginning of an unending exile, a slow eraser that lasted generations. The impact of this system rippled far beyond the walls of the empire. Across the Balkans and Eastern Europe, entire communities were left without women of childbearing age. Villages withered, families vanished. The demographic imbalance became a wound that never fully healed. It was not only the loss of life, but the loss of culture. Songs, dialects, and traditions carried by these women disappeared with them. Over centuries, this silent theft reshaped the identity of entire regions. Historians for a long time preferred to overlook these horrors. They spoke of Ottoman grandeur, architecture, trade, and tolerance, but not of the women who vanished into its shadows. The official archives, though filled with evidence, were treated as mere administrative records, not confessions of a civilization's cruelty. Only in recent decades, with greater access to these documents, have scholars begun to uncover the scale of what happened. A system so vast, so deliberate that it rivals any form of institutionalized slavery in human history. The Ottomans called it order. History calls it a tragedy. Yet even tragedy struggles to contain the enormity of what was done. It was not only the destruction of individuals, but of generations. A deliberate transformation of humanity into resource, identity into inventory, and at the center of it all stood the empire's unshakable faith in its own righteousness. That was its most terrifying weapon, the belief that cruelty, when organized and sanctified, could be justice. The Ottoman system of enslavement left wounds that stretched far beyond the empire's borders and long after its fall. Its legacy endured not only in historical records, but in the very structure of societies it once dominated. For centuries, its effects rippled through the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, shaping demography, identity, and memory in ways that still echo today. Tens of thousands of women were torn from their homes each decade during the empire's expansion. Entire villages were emptied. Generations disappeared. In some regions, the loss was so severe that population recovery took centuries. Families that had once carried their traditions through music, language, and faith were wiped out or forever changed. The empire gained not only wealth, but power over memory itself. Every woman stolen and renamed represented a culture slowly erased. The Ottoman state didn't just conquer land. It conquered history. Even in the modern age, traces of this system can still be found in the inherited silence of certain communities. Folk tales that speak of women taken by the Turks. Lullabies mourning vanished daughters, and rituals of mourning that survived long after the reason for them was forgotten. All are remnants of that trauma. The efficiency with which the empire turned human suffering into a bureaucratic process was what made it so unique and so terrifying. The scribes who maintained those endless ledgers of slaves didn't see themselves as monsters. They were simply doing their jobs. They saw numbers, transactions, profits, not lives. That is what made the Ottoman model so enduring. It removed emotion from atrocity. It proved that cruelty could coexist with civilization, that brutality could be organized, justified, and recorded as if it were progress. Historians studying Ottoman archives have found these records astonishingly detailed. They describe where captives came from, how much they were sold for, and which official received the tax. Some even document the names given to women after their conversion. New identities written neatly in the margins beside the ones that were erased. For centuries, many scholars chose to ignore what these documents revealed. They preferred to focus on the empire's military power, its art, its architecture, its tolerance. The suffering of the enslaved was treated as a footnote, something inconvenient, something to be softened or forgotten. But the truth persisted. It survived in the diaries of escaped captives, in European letters describing the slave markets of Constantinople, and in the archives of monasteries that recorded ransoms paid to rescue Christian women. Slowly, piece by piece, a clearer picture began to emerge, one that could no longer be romanticized. This was not the chaos of medieval warfare. It was policy. It was order. It was empire perfected through domination. And it worked because it was systematic, because it was efficient, because it hid cruelty behind law and suffering behind paperwork. The psychological cost of such a system cannot be measured. Women who survived and were later freed described a loss deeper than physical captivity. They had forgotten their own voices, their languages, their prayers. Many could no longer remember their families' faces. They were free, yet never truly themselves again. For those who remained enslaved, the empire offered no mercy and no end. Their children inherited their condition, a lineage of servitude encoded in law. A daughter born to an enslaved mother was property from the moment she took her first breath. The system reproduced itself effortlessly, ensuring that the shadow of slavery would haunt generations to come. And yet within this machinery of cruelty, small acts of humanity survived. Some women found friendship among fellow captives. Some masters moved by conscience or faith granted freedom to those who had served them. A few women even rose through wit or courage to positions of influence, subtly shaping the world that once enslaved them. But these exceptions only highlight the horror of the rule. For every story of mercy, there were thousands of silence. The full weight of this legacy did not end with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Its influence spread throughout the Islamic world, shaping how other empires justified their own systems of servitude. The Ottoman model, with its detailed laws, tax structures, and religious validation became a blueprint for others. This is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of all, that such an organized form of cruelty could be seen as legitimate governance. The demographic scars remain visible even today. In regions once under Ottoman control, records show dramatic gender imbalances that persisted for generations. Folk traditions from Eastern Europe speak of the night of capture, when families would hide their daughters in forests or caves at the sound of approaching armies. These memories, passed down through centuries, became the silent folklore of survival. The eraser went deeper than bodies. It erased languages. Dialects spoken by captive women vanished from entire regions. Religious traditions and songs disappeared, leaving only fragments, echoes of what was lost. For the Ottomans, this system was not evil. It was civilization. It was order justified by divine will and political necessity. The empire saw itself as the guardian of faith, the bringer of law, even as it turned human beings into commodities. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all: how easily cruelty can disguise itself as duty. The story of these women forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about humanity itself. The Ottoman slave system did not thrive because its people were uniquely brutal. It thrived because they believed they were right. They believed they were lawful. They believed they were moral. When cruelty is systematized, when it is given structure and purpose, it no longer feels like evil. It feels like administration. And that is why this history matters. The fate of the women captured by the Ottomans is not only a tragedy of the past, it is a warning to the present. It shows how easily societies can normalize inhumanity when it is wrapped in the language of law, faith, or progress. It shows how civilization and barbarism can live side by side, even feed off each other. These women, whose names were erased, but whose suffering still speaks through centuries, remind us that progress is not permanent. Morality does not evolve on its own. Humanity must be defended actively, constantly, or it will vanish into systems that justify cruelty in the name of order. Their voices may be lost to time, but their silence is its own kind of testimony, one that demands we remember.